We're joined by Chicago native and assistant professor of race and media at the University of South Carolina, Dr. Jabari Evans. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So, Dr. Evans is going to speak to us a little bit about something we've just learned not that long ago. The United Center recently canceled NBA YoungBoy's concert, which was scheduled for tomorrow. The United Center did not give out any reason for this, but we have seen other incidents at other concert venues across the country where violence did break out at some of these NBA YoungBoy concerts. And Dr. Evans is going to lead us and give us a little bit of perspective on what we're seeing here. So, first, I want to start with just how familiar are you with NBA YoungBoy, and could you explain to our viewers how would you describe his music?
Well, I'll say NBA YoungBoy is someone who is an internet sensation. He's someone whose music kind of has sprouted out from what one would call the underground. But he comes from a tradition that is actually very much associated with drill rap, which is actually a subgenre of hip hop that was birthed on the south side of Chicago. The interesting thing about it is he's sort of taken it, making it his own, and he's become very popular. It's one of those things where we see someone like NBA YoungBoy being the transition between artists that go through the traditional industry, major label pipeline to someone who is able to use social media platforms and streaming services to their own advantage and cultivate a real dedicated and loyal fan base. And I would say he's probably the poster child for that era of sort of music.
What was your reaction when you found out that his concert here in Chicago at the United Center was going to be canceled?
I kind of was under the impression that if they were going to cancel it, they should have never booked the concert in the first place, because there's been a very tenuous relationship between the city of Chicago and this genre that I've talked to you about, drill music, and beyond that, there's been a public feud between NBA YoungBoy and Lil Durk, who's a local star who has a lot of reputation in the Chicagoland area, in particular his local area, which is titled O Block, titled after the slain young man Odie Perry, who passed away at, I believe, 14 years old. And they've had these public feuds back and forth. NBA YoungBoy's kind of camp and entourage, as well as Lil Durk's camp and entourage. And there's been a lot of back and forth, and there's been a lot of conversation and discourse online about, if NBA YoungBoy were to ever have a tour date in Chicago, that it would be disrupted, and that it would be disrupted violently. And so I think that's something that I know the city of Chicago takes seriously and doesn't take lightly. But I think there's also this underlying capitalist motive of wanting to sort of cash in on the popularity of both of these artists and hopefully sell out an arena. But, I think that there's also some real world implications on public safety. And I think that's what's come to bear here.
And you mentioned popularity. Obviously, if you're getting a chance to book a tour date at the United Center, they think that you're going to be able to sell a lot of tickets here. What do you think that this cancellation should say to, I guess, NBA YoungBoy's fans who, of course, paid their money and were looking forward to seeing him tomorrow?
This is an unfortunate thing to me, because I think what ends up happening here is hip hop is becoming a scapegoat more broadly in mainstream media. But I think what goes on here is that NBA YoungBoy's fans are now labeled and stigmatized as being sort of associated with being the wrong crowd, or being sort of the wrong type of fan. When I think the United Center is always going to have artists that show up and sell out the venue. But I think it says something when people from hip hop, those who come from marginalized communities, low income backgrounds, are able to sort of make their way through the ranks, especially in the way that NBA YoungBoy has done so. And for that opportunity to sort of be snatched away, due to something that I would say is about clout chasing, politics, bureaucracy, and in some ways, empty threats, potentially, it's unfortunate, because that becomes the narrative around someone who is a phenomenal artist who makes great music. And now we're sort of shifting the focus away from that artistry into what could potentially be a public safety issue.
I'm glad you mentioned the safety issue there. I guess going forward, how do you feel like maybe the city of Chicago, whether it's the United Center or other concert venues, how do they find the balance of keeping in mind safety concerns, but also supporting artists from here, from Chicago, that are so important to the vibrant music scene here?
Well, clearly, drill rap is controversial, but it also is a sign of the vibrance of our youth expression in the city of Chicago. And I think, again, just to echo the last point that I made, I think it's a shame that we get to look at drill from a deficit perspective rather than a strength perspective. And so I think as we see this move forward, I hope that, the narrative can shift. And I also hope that those who are in office, policymakers, can also start to deal a little bit more directly with the artists and their management and sort of come to some real resolutions that allow for fans to get to see the talented artists that they love, especially in a music-rich city like Chicago, a festival-laden city like Chicago, that often has gaps that they can't fill within the hip-hop genre, though we have artists that are being born and bred right in our backyards. And, the fact that someone like an NBA YoungBoy wants to have a tour date in Chicago and it gets missed, I mean, that's a big deal. And so the hope is that, the powers that be can sort of mitigate this, because drill has been around for over a decade at this point, and many of its, strongest artists are over 30 years old. And I think it's about time that we stop thinking about them as young, reckless teenagers and start to reconcile their popularity and their mainstream appeal.
What do you think that this decision by the United Center means for other artists who may be affiliated with drill rap or similar music to NBA YoungBoy and their, I guess, pursuits of coming here to Chicago? Do you see potentially other venues taking the same route as the United Center, or do you maybe see this as more of an isolated incident?
I think this is very much an isolated incident. I think it's an isolated incident that is very much attributed to the subgenre of drill rap. I think we've seen over a number of years, whether it's Lil Durk, whether it's Chief Keef, whether it's G Herbo, folks that are interacting with these artists or beefing with these artists are not going to be allowed to be showcased, because there's already sort of a public safety issue that's surrounded the subgenre of drill. And drill originates on the south side of Chicago. And so that in and of itself lends towards venue owners who have long not let local artists from this genre perform just be very wary and very concerned, especially about security issues, insurance issues. It's just a lot of a hassle, and you wonder, as much as these artists could fill a venue and could make these venues money, at the same token, it sometimes becomes not worth the risk.
Dr. Jabari Evans, thanks so much for your time this afternoon, giving us a lot of perspective as the United Center recently canceled NBA YoungBoy's concert, which was scheduled for tomorrow. So far, we haven't heard anything from the United Center on that decision. Thanks again for your time, and look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you.